In this lesson, we'll use the base object to create linked bridges between the pavilions. So at the moment, we have these free spaced out pavilions that are on this ground level base. And what we need to do now is create a type of path that links them all together so that people can cross from one to the other. Remember again that we're going to flood this entire ground surface. So we want to have a dry area, which is actually not going to be much of a bridge. It's just going to be a raised section, which isn't going to be wet so that people can walk across. So what I'd like to mention here is that instead of going and creating a brand new object for all of these pavilions, you can take a much quicker route to model what you need to do. Obviously, creating them independently and drawing out a separate spline. For example, if I did want to use up a lot of time and do it the slow way, I could take a line and I could start to draw individual paths in between them, or draw the central line and then try and chamfer that and create an object. But what I like to show you is a much quicker method, and it's going to be using this base object that we have underneath. Just before I do start that process, I do want to go to this base object and see that everything is correctly spaced, because I want to now be able to edit the paths before I start to create the geometry. So what I mean by that is that let's go and turn on our columns and let's have a look at where our paths are going to be. Now we're going to be using these white lines on our base geometry to create our paths. So you can see that in some cases we actually have a column object that is on top of the path, and we need to basically now go and move that around so that we can ever so slightly edit it and get things in the right position. So I'm going to isolate all of this, and we can start to see where some of these collisions start to happen. For example, here we have a column colliding with a pavilion. Here we have something very close as well. In this case, we have the path going right through the column, which would create issues. Here we pretty much are okay, and over here there's pretty much nothing being obstructed. So I can now take this base object and I can start moving the vertices around, and basically everything is going to start to be edited with it. So you can see that all of the objects, they update and move, and you can see how things rotate around as we move single objects, or at least vertices. I'm not actually moving the pavilion, I'm just moving the base object that the pavilion is scattered on. So you can see how everything has this relationship. What I'd also like to do, I know that the bridge is going to be on the left here, I'd like to move this vertice in because I would like to actually create another pavilion here. So I'm going to go to this pavilion scattered object, I'm going to undo this editable poly so that I can get this one back in the game, and I'm going to recreate another editable poly and then just delete all of the other ones. That means I'm now going to be including this one, and you'll see why once we create our networked path, it's quite nice to have that one in place. So now I'm going to re-delete these, and now I'm going to be still working with this editable poly, just moving these around slightly more, getting these ones slightly out the way. So the path isn't going to be that wide, so we just want to miss these main areas. Perhaps this one we can create something roundabout over there. And that should create quite an interesting dynamic around our structure and around the building. So this is quite a nice way to work with the objects, because obviously we're not creating any complexity by moving things around. Everything is happening automatically while we move our base geometry. So here as well, you can see that this is rather close to our central core tower. So I'm going to want to move that. But also we can also imagine that perhaps we want the base of this to actually have the central part where people will be able to access all of the others. So we can go now to the editable poly of the scatter and then just delete this single pavilion, because that is where we're going to actually have that main baobab tree that's going to pull us up into the building. So now that we have all of the paths adjusted, this one is okay, everything else is fine, we can start to work on the path. So what I'm going to do, instead of creating the path directly out of the space geometry, because if I went and edited this, obviously that will affect my scatter, I need to make a copy of it. So I'm going to type Control V on the keyboard again, make sure it's copied. And I'm now going to take this entire object with my scattered pavilions and isolate that out. Now I'm going to take the edge selection, and I'm basically going to select all of the edges besides the ones on the outside. So I'm just going to delete or deselect all of these, And you can see now that there is a link between all of the different pavilions that exist on this base. And we also have this link coming down to this point, which is where our joining bridge is going to be. Then with all of these edges selected, you can right click and chamfer. And I'm going to use a value of about 0.8 meters, which should give me a nice 1.5 meter path in its minimum. Next, I'm going to select the polys that consist of this path. So you can go and select everything and then deselect the edges again. And you basically want to get a selection of just the paths alone. Once you have that selected, you can then invert that selection and delete everything else. And we can now make it a little bit more organic and a bit interesting. This is an optional step, just if you do have that style of architecture, is we can add a mesh smooth modifier and we can give it an extra iteration just to create a little bit more of an interesting look. So what we have right now is this kind of organically stringy kind of network happening between all these pavilion paths, and this is what people would walk on as this raised little path. And the reason why it's nice is because it allows the flow of traffic to work quite nicely as people circulate between all of this, instead of having these narrow corridor style paths linking everything. I just think it will create quite an interesting look on the ground floor. So next thing you can do right now is to look at how this is going to be raised up off the floor. If we undo the isolation, we can now go and give it a shell modifier just to give it a bit of depth. And I think the value of 0.15 is perfect because it'll give you a slightly lower level than these pavilions. So you won't actually have to boolean or cut or edit anything. They'll just penetrate right through, and you can basically choose to have a different floor material. So you can literally see where these nodes are sitting on top of your path. So we will basically have this gray surface down here as water. This will be your walking path, and these will be your slightly raised expo pavilions. So that is pretty much it that I wanted to cover in this lesson. The main lesson here is that it's a good idea to always use your existing geometry to derive your new objects instead of creating new objects from scratch. You're going to really have a much faster workflow when you have that base geometry to work from, and especially when you create situations for yourself where you don't have to recreate your scatter or you have to recreate anything. You just move base geometry and everything updates underneath it. So having that set up for yourself makes a really magic workflow, and it should definitely give you a big heads up when you are working on a tight deadline. Great, we're going to go now into the next lesson. We're going to create our bridge element, which is going to be very similar to this object that we have underneath. We're basically going to continue on this editable poly, and we're going to go and extract out and continue with that form so we can link up to our shore over here on the left hand side. And then after that we can continue developing the building, and slowly but surely we'll start finishing off and having a look at how we can light and render the entire assembly. So all of that is coming right up, so definitely stay watching the videos, and we're going to jump into the next exciting part in the next lesson.